what we have for us today on the beginning of this week and getting very close to the weekly reset, which will launch us into the first week of Season 1 with the normal and the heroic raid becoming available, as well as our new scuffed version of the early level Mythic Plus keys being now Mythic 0, since it will be the equivalent of a Mythic Plus 10 key in difficulty. We have what I guess we can say will likely be the last round of tuning before the season actually releases. Now, before we go into the actual tuning, there is somewhat, at the very least, of a confirmation from Blizzard, because in their announcement they made with this message, they said, we will then look forward to additional tuning that we will develop during Heroic Week, which we will use to address anything needed for PvP Mythic Plus and Mythic Raiding on then September the 17th. So basically what they're saying is, if you know your spec is OP, sandbag Heroic Week, pretend you are weaker than you actually are, so you don't get nerfed by September the 17th. So the balance tuning announced by Blizzard to go live in this next reset. Let's just start by excluding the least relevant ones, which are 2 changes for tanks. One is for Blood and one is for Vengeance. Blood is getting 5% more damage to all of their damage in exchange for having the damage gain of their tier set cut in half. Instead of gaining 1% damage per bone shield charge, you get 0.5% of damage, so you lose practically the same damage buff you gain. So there isn't really much going the way of Blood DK in terms of a damage buff. On top of that, the damage of a Blood DK was good enough already. It wasn't one of the specs you were thinking of when thinking about a damage buff as a tank. The other tank was Vengeance. Vengeance got a 3% damage increase, slightly smaller than a Blood DK, and then also nerfs given to their tier set. Less damage from Soul Cleave, as well as a slightly lower chance to shatter one soul fragment. So in the case of these 2 tanks, it was mostly about redistributing their power more on their natural toolkit rather than being tied to their tier set, without really any major swings on those either being buffs or being nerfs. Where we have other specs being touched, this time it's just for DPS specs. We are talking about Unholy, Death Knight, Havoc, Demon Hunter, Devastation Evoker, as well as Enhancement Shaman. Starting from Unholy, because Unholy is in a pretty interesting situation, more so than the other 3 very likely. Unholy gets a 5% damage buff, while also having their 4-piece set bonus nerfed. When you gain haste, because you're summoning a minion, instead of gaining 2% haste, you are gaining 1%, and then the maximum cap will be 4% instead of 8. So the TLDR is that you are losing haste in your tier set. It's practically, at the very best, a 4% haste nerf. So you're gaining 5% damage, you're losing haste. How much of a change is this? We said Unholy was in an interesting situation because Unholy has been, let's just say, shadowed by the performance of Frost. Right, ever since the beginning of the beta, that became quite visible when you were even struggling to even find Unholy Death Knights in Mythic Plus. You could only find Frost DKs due to overall just having a better profile for Mythic Plus, even though, for example, if you went and looked at their consistent AoE damage, even their burst AoE damage, with certain builds, Unholy Death Knights was easily able to smoke a Frost DK. When it came to actually simulating some Mythic Plus performances, or even just checking the beta for real results of Mythic Plus performances, Frost was definitely better. Unholy did have some positive. They do have a good damage profile. They are also one of the better and bigger beneficiaries of Power Infusion. At the moment, they are in the top 4 more or less of best PI targets, together with Beast Mastery Hunter and Demolock and Assassination Rogue. They also have one of the strongest burst windows in 40 seconds as a spec, which is always a good damage profile to have. When it comes to the tier set, and that's likely the reason why we are seeing here, we have both Havoc and Unholy, but also Devastation and Enhancement being nerfed, is because if we go to the power of the tier set prior to the nerf, so this is still a picture of a completely unnerfed situation. You see 13% for Unholy, 10% for Havoc, then you see 15% for Devastation and 17% for Enhancement. And these are exactly the 4 ones who had their tier sets nerfed. So, you know, it makes sense from Blizzard's end to try to lower the power of these 4 tier sets. So, post-nerf, Unholy went from 13.3% to 9.1%. So we have a near 4-ish% damage nerf given the way of Unholy Death Knight. But Unholy Death Knight then was also buffed by 5% in all of their damage. So actually the result is that in the end, compared to what they had before, Unholy has been slightly buffed compared to before. This is the new Unholy and this is the old Unholy. So they gained a bit of damage basically with this change. The other spec, however, goes in reverse because the other spec is Havoc Demon Hunter. So much like Unholy DK, they get a 4% damage increase, but they get their tier set nerfed. The bonus damage of their Chaos Strike goes from 20% down to 12%, and then the Fury cost reduction of Blade Dance is now 30% instead of 50%. Now, when talking about single target, if you're looking at the current build, which is Aldrachi, generally speaking, the better performing one in single target, the damage of Blade Dance, which then turns into Death Sweep, as well as the damage of Chaos Strike, which then turns into Annihilation, we're talking about almost close to 40% of your damage, which is what is being nerfed. So it's not a small number. Now, we have seen, as mentioned, the power of their tier set being quite high as well. Not as high as Unholy, but still quite powerful. After this nerf, we mentioned Unholy losing almost 4% of their damage, 4% of their damage from their tier set. Havoc goes from 10.4 to 7.4. So they lose 3% of the damage from their tier set. So the point from Blizzard is roughly the same. Give them back some power in their general spec power, and then reduce a little bit the importance of their tier sets. For Havoc, we can say it is perhaps slightly less relevant, because in the end, even their performance after the nerfs has still remained one of the more competitive ones in single target. And on top of that, Havoc is the only spec in Demon Hunter that can play a DPS, right? It's more relevant for Unholy to try to catch up to the performance of Frost, to be the one that is more viable compared to the other. But for Havoc, it's a more chill and laid-back situation. They have really no competition in their own class to be the best DPS. After Havoc, though, we do have a new entry. The new entry is Devastation. Because Devastation did not have their working sims for months, and they only got them recently, just a few days ago, apparently, though, Blizzard already knew what's up. They already knew what's up because they have nerfed them. They buffed their damage, all of their damage by 3%. So we started with a 5% buff for Unholy, then 4% for Havoc, now 3% for Devastation, in return for nerfing their tier set. The damage of your Pyre and Disintegrate, flat damage increase from their 2-piece, goes from 10% to 6%, so you lose just 4% of your finisher, your spender's damage. And then the 4-piece set bonus that was reducing the cooldown of Eternity's Surge by 5 seconds, instead is now 3 seconds. And that's, you know, visible here in the game, where they had the second strongest tier set gain out of any DPS. Now, the value of these nerfs in total are, again, barely a 3% nerf, together with the 3% buff that they receive. So again, we're talking about something very neutral for Devastation. It's mostly just to redistribute their power from their tier set to their generic power of the spec. So their change is practically almost irrelevant. They go from 1499 to 1489. This 10,000 DPS change can happen practically every day when a spec does a new sim with different enchants, different rings, different trinkets. That's practically the level of the change that Devastation has received in their performance. So not really that relevant either. It was mostly to lower down the power of the tier set of Devastation, which was the second highest, because of course the first highest, the highest, was Enhancement. Enhancement also gets a nerf, and again it goes even more lower down. We started with a 5% damage buff to Unholy, then 4 to Havoc, then 3 to Devastation. Now we are at a 2% damage buff to Enhancement, and in return the nerf is that their 2-piece set bonus only their 2-piece set bonus, gets nerfed because now their Storm Strike, Lava Lash, Ice Strike and Crash Lightning deal 6% bonus damage instead of 15% bonus damage. Now, about this is the interesting thing. And the interesting thing is that Enhancement was the strongest of the hero talents, and they have received the smallest nerf out of all of them by quite a lot. What is also even more interesting, as you see by the numbers, is that what is being nerfed by almost 2/3 isn't this, which would have given a large hit to the power of Enhancement, but is instead this, which is worth practically nothing, or technically it's worth 1.7% of your damage. So the result is that if you nerf this by 2/3 and you end up with a 0.6% damage increase instead of a 1.7% damage increase, but your spec is buffed by 2%, the result is that you're not losing damage, you're gaining damage. So Enhancement goes from having a 17.2% strong tier set to having a 16.1% strong tier set, but they get buffed by 2%, meaning the result is they do more damage than they did before. And now they are clear ahead first in terms of DPS. Not even a single spec breaks 1600 DPS. They are clear into the 1700s right now. Super high damage, far out damaging anyone else. Now, it is relevant to point out for the ones who have not been keeping track of the changes of Enhancement that right now there has been a split. The typical build that was around the 1510, 1520 DPS of Enhancement was the typical Elementalist Stormbringer type of build that they had been running for a while, so ignoring Elemental Blast, playing with Tempest Strike, going down the fire side a bit while playing Stormbringer, and then a new build was born. A build that ignored the fire side, went to pick up Doom Winds and played with Elemental Blast, and the result was that with a new APL, the resulting sims of this hybrid build was significantly higher than the ones from the Elementalist build. And this build has kept gaining more and more damage over the last few days compared to the traditional one, and even then, the traditional one is still one of the highest results still that we have right now, so it's not really a bad situation to be in when you are an Enhancement Shaman. Anyways, with this being done, we can now see the results in full and also see the clear picture of what Blizzard was trying to do, which was singling out the best performing tier sets and nerfing them. Of course, then now we are stuck with the question we pointed out at the beginning. Blizzard said they were going to be observing the results of the Heroic Week to then layer down some changes for the release of Mythic Week. The question would be what we would like to see in terms of changes. Because of course, for example, Blizzard was quite able to identify the best performing ones. So they were able to see, to have the data and the knowledge to realize these 4 tier sets were overperforming. What about, though? What about the opposite? The other way around, the tier sets that were doing absolutely terribly. Why haven't these been buffed? The same goes for the actual overall performance of certain specs. You know, what about Balanced Druid? What about Fire Mage, even Red Paladin, Shadow Priest? All 3 practically of the Warlock specs. For now, they did a good job identifying the better performing ones and trying to stop them, besides Enhancement Shaman, which sort of backfired. I guess now what is left is to wait to see how good they will be in actually balancing and tuning upwards with buffs rather than downwards with nerfs. But for today, on this Monday, this was the recap of the balance tuning changes that will go live in a couple of days with the weekly reset that will jumpstart the season. And as a reminder, just to get ahead of it, I will also be streaming the release of the season. You'll be able to check out directly straight from Twitch, or even just join the Discord and get notified whenever my stream goes live. So, with this out of the way on this Monday, we are now leaving each other. Thank you guys, of course, for having watched the video, as well as for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, you know, I'm happy when it's cloudy and when it's raining, but can we have like a 10-minute pause when I have to go out? Just, you know, a little one.